Hey, Brandon.
Hi, Shelley.
How are you?
I'm doing good. Doing
Good.
good. Yeah.
For anyone who doesn't already know you, which everyone should, because I think you're great. Although,
Thank
like, you don't
you.
have a channel here on, you
I
don't have a channel or
know.
anything,
I
but
know.
you
It's,
are,
yeah,
we knew each other in college, which
we
is just,
did.
yeah. And then we reconnected over social media, but you are a writer and I would say an activist.
Oh, thank
And
you.
yeah, and now you're here to share your superlatives. So, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So my superlatives are like kind of made up because someone already did most surprising. So I was like, most like, and I was like, oh, someone already
You
did
could
that.
reuse a superlative. It would
Yeah.
just be to you.
But
But anyways,
I would, yeah. So I decided to kind of go with like most favorite, like new favorite, as well as an old favorite. And since I kind of, we've already discussed ones that were like disappointing, so I can leave them out.
unless you
I'll
want to
leave,
share, unless you want to like help
we'll get
steer
to,
people in the
yeah,
right
yeah.
direction. I don't
Oh
know.
yeah, that's true. Yeah. Well, I think the ones that I picked. So like one of my new favorites that I was also kind of surprised by was a work of nonfiction that I have, and it's also like a fat chunky book, and it did win a ton of awards, so I shouldn't have been that surprised that it was going to be good, but it's a style of creative nonfiction that I have a mixed relationship with, where they try to make it very narrative driven, which can work really well for some. Like I think Patrick Radden Keefe is one who does it really, really well. But there's some I read where I'm like, you're really inserting a lot of emotion for something that happened in 1950 that you were not there for.
Oh,
But
yeah.
this one did it really well, and I thought it would be good. I bought it on a whim in New York. It's called All the Frequent Trouble of Our Days by Rebecca Donner. And it's the true story of an American woman at the heart of German resistance to Hitler. So, this book, in terms of historical research and how little this writer, Rebecca Donner, who is a direct descendant of this woman, Mildred Harnick, who was this American woman from Milwaukee who went to Germany to do her PhD degree. She was a leftist Marxist literary person. She married a German man, and they were like very
Okay.
poor grad students.
Okay.
But they were there in Berlin when Berlin was still kind of like pre-Nazi takeover, this like bastion of like the leftist intelligentsia and like
Oh,
liberation. And I don't know if I mean, an example would be kind of like you could talk about Cabaret, the musical, where there's like just very gay reference for myself, but
okay.
but I don't care, it works.
No.
Like where it was just like kind of this like very countercultural space in the midst of this rising right-wing fascism.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah. So what happens though is that essentially, to start at the end, Mildred actually ended up getting executed and was one of the few Americans to be executed by Hitler and his administration.
Oh.
And Rebecca Donner is actually like, I think, her great 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 niece. I'm probably wrong, but she is a relative. So this also is partially like a family history. And
Oh.
she uses, it's really amazing. There's different photographs, and the way it's structured is in these different sections that break off into tiny little chapters.
Oh.
So it reads fast. So it's like I
Yeah.
bought this. I had brought another book when I went on vacation last August to New York, and I'd finished it. And I purposely didn't pack anymore because I knew I would buy some. And so I
Yeah.
got this at Greenlight Books in Brooklyn, and I had tried checking this out from the library that year, and I just like, I don't know, I just couldn't get into it. And so I was like, you know what? I'll try it. And it just like drew me in because it kind of reads almost like a thriller, because Mildred gave different teaching lessons to local kids in the neighborhood, and they lived very close to some Nazi officers, which was like very terrifying. So it's like a very intense read. You very much get the idea of how people were spying on each other. And you also get
Oh.
these moments of levity. And I think the most stunning moment is when Mildred and her husband, who he was related to a very outspoken German Protestant priest, who was also executed by Hitler.
Oh.
And so you get this like micro history of all these people in this resistance and this like leftist political history. And then you get this like really amazing gender analysis of what it meant for this young American woman who did not want this kind of like basic basic
Yeah.
life, and went to Germany to bring and study and talk about American literature in this very particular populist way at the height of like growing fascism. And so it's about like the effect of her death on her family in America. It's also about the fact that their work actually helped some Jewish families escape, and kind of traces that. And at one point, one of her students was this American boy that she was teaching German to, that ended up being an unofficial courier between her and this American member of the embassy, who was kind of trying to get this information back to the government about the level of fascism in Germany at the time.
Right.
So that was like, I was
Wow.
all about this book. I read this so quickly. And you know, considering that she's a fiction writer who clearly has historian chops, like the way she used, I think also the sections when Mildred's in prison, and she gets Rebecca Donner found these pieces of information of women that were in prison with Mildred, and it just like brings this whole very harrowing moment to life. It was like, I was just kind of so impressed as a person who does nonfiction historical writing. I was just like so inspired in a way that she did it, because it could have read as very false and very overly novelized, and it didn't. It just was like this natural flowing, well organized. And I think because she wrote in short sections, she did a really good job at making the information and narrative almost bite-sized, because it's a lot of information.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little chunkster right there.
It is. It is. It's
Like, how
like
are you bringing
a
this to
little
the
over
channel?
500 pages. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And like, I mean, it won like the National Book Critics Award, and it won a Pen America Award. Like, I can see why it was so acclaimed. So that's
Right.
like a new favorite.
Yeah.
But an old favorite that I'm about to reread, that I reread during the summer, is a memoir called Fierce Attachments by Vivian Gornick.
Oh, I've never
And
heard of this book.
so
You're like,
um
oh,
let
I
me
can't wait to hear about it.
let me talk
Tell me,
about.
tell me about this.
So the New York Times critics a couple years ago created like a big list of the best memoirs of the past however many years, and this was number one. And so so when I reread it in 2020, I thought I hadn't read it before, but I was wrong. I had read it before. I just forgot that I read it. And so Vivian Gornick, she's kind of like an East Coast version of Joan Didion. So she kind of started out as a journalist for the Village Voice. And she was like a lefty, very involved in feminism and consciousness raising. And that was kind of like the subject of a lot of her work. And she grew up in the Bronx. Yes, the Bronx.
Yeah.
Working class parents. Her parents were involved in the Communist Party, very lefty. And so this book, though, was actually her big breakout success. It came out in the 80s. It was kind of revolutionized how memoirs could be structured. Because at that point, from what I understand, outside of people like Maya Angelou, who's, you know, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sing was like a huge memoir to be a bestseller. Most of them had kind of been a straightforward, this is not about that, but like more about like celebrity memoirs were kind of more, or children of celebrity memoirs was kind of the big thing.
Oh, yeah, right. It's like a tell-all
Yes, like
moment.
a tell-all.
Yeah.
So she was like in her 40s, late 30s, early 40s when this book came out, and it was just like unlike anything she had written. And she basically writes about her and her mom and this other woman who lived in their building, who was a sex worker. And it starts from childhood and it bounces between her childhood all the way to her like adulthood, but there's moments in the present where it's just her and her mom taking these walks in New York City. And her mom is a character, and anyone with a complicated parent relationship, especially with a parent who has a big personality, will really get this book. And her dad dies when she's young, and so it's about her mom being this like very emotionally big personality, and it's also about her own intellectual and writing development and her failed first marriage. And it takes her from like the East Coast to the West Coast. It takes her from like being a married wife to being a single woman discovering feminism, to different aspects of New York culture, like City College, New York, and what that was like in the 50s for this like post-World War II group of kids who were not maybe old enough to be in the war and were too old to be a baby boomer in the hippie era. So it's like a very interesting take, and the way she captures New York and the way she charts these walks and these conversations are just like really fascinating. And when I reread it the second time, not realizing it was the second time, because I was reading and I was like, this feels familiar. And I was like, oh, you read this like a million years ago and just like completely forgot. I was like, why does this feel familiar? And she's written a lot of other books that are kind of like memoir. She was really kind of like one of the first people to really talk about personal narrative. And she has a really popular, it's not my favorite book of hers, but it is a favorite book of a lot of other people, called The Situation and the Story. And so she's like, a lot of people make the mistake in using personal narrative where they're just explaining the situation, but they don't have the story driving it forward.
Yeah, actually, that's a huge conversation going around booktube, or it had gone around, in which some people say, I don't want to rate memoirs. I don't want to judge memoirs because it's someone's story. And I was like, but I feel that whenever you're telling a story, it always has a beginning, middle, and end. And there is a way to structure it, and there's a way to make sure that there's a driving force behind an interest for the reader to attach themselves to, so that you want to continue to read.
Exactly.
And so I always am judgy. I'm very judgy about memoirs. And I'm like, I'm sorry that they went through X, Y, and Z, but it really wasn't a compelling narrative. It wasn't
100%.
compelling, you know,
Oh,
or like,
yeah.
you know, yeah, like it was boring, or it was blah, blah, blah. And it doesn't mean that what they went through was boring. It just means the way that it read was boring to me, you know. So
yeah. I mean, and that's the thing, is like, that's why she said that she had tried writing this so many times, and it wasn't until she like started bringing in these walks she had with her mom that it really propels the narrative forward as like a touch point. And the range of their conversations are always really different, and it always sparks some sort of sense memory thing. And then there's a moment in the book where she has an affair with a married man, and that whole section is fascinating because it relates back to her experiences and understanding their neighbor Dorothy, who was a single mother but also a sex worker, and what the mom's relationship to that woman, their friendship or lack of friendship, was. So it's just very level, and it's not really complicated. There's like not really chapters, like it just goes straight through. And it's just so well written. And her mom became kind of a mini celebrity after the book came out. And at first the mom was like, I love this book, I approve of it. And then like later she'd be like, how dare you write these things about me? And she used to like sign people's books because they would go on these walks, like parts of Manhattan. So it's like a fascinating picture of the Bronx. It's a fascinating picture of New York changing over the course of like the 50s, 60s, and 70s and the 80s. I mean, she gets mugged at one point. She has like all sorts of different ways of picking up people's dialogue and character that is just uncanny. And, you know, I think Joan Didion as an essayist and memoirist gets a lot more attention for understandable reasons. But I think Vivian Gornick is just as much up there, and really doesn't get as much attention, I think, maybe even on booktube. I don't think she gets as much attention as she could. Yeah, and she's very critical of her own work because she recently had a couple of her older books re-released, and she was like, honestly, I don't know why these were released. I didn't like them. And
that's cool though.
Yeah, she's a very interesting thinker, and she's a very, she has a whole book about rereading books, which will lead to my other part of my superlative, and about what it means to reread something. It's called Unfinished Business, and she talks about revisiting certain books over and over again in her life by like D.H. Lawrence or I don't know.
Oh,
So she's a
yeah.
very, yeah, she has another great book about walking called The Odd Woman in the City, which is about conversations she has with an older gay male friend of hers and about the concept of the odd woman. So she's very like city oriented. I'm a very city oriented person. I mean, I live in San Francisco. So it's like that kind of metropolis urban way of
Yeah.
living is kind of on my mind a lot, especially because I do history around San Francisco.
Hmm.
So it's fun to read things that are not just straight up historical examinations and read things like that memoir. And I've read one memoir I will not be returning to, and I will say it here, is one I read was I was really disappointed in Elvira's memoir, Yours Cruelly, Elvira, Mistress of the Dark.
Oh,
At least a
I haven't
memoir
heard
that
of
was
that.
kind of critically acclaimed, but to me, it was just so straightforward and this happened, this happened, this happened, that it didn't
Hmm.
really resonate. It didn't really resonate. So
Sure.
so yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah. But
No, that happens though. That
yeah,
happens. They're like, you're just
yeah.
trying to say something. I mean, you're trying to just tell a story and you're not really thinking about the artistry that goes behind it, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And so like, yeah, so like All the Frequent Troubles of Our Days is one I plan on revisiting just because I was so impressed by it. But like this one I like revisiting like maybe once a year, and you can read it like in a couple days. And I would say the newest one I read for fiction was Sula,
Oh,
which I had read Beloved a couple years ago and been finally wanting to read this. And this was this little slim thing. Like I'm still thinking about it. I still want to
oh,
read it. It's her second book, and After the
okay.
Bluest Eye.
Yeah.
And I just am like haunted by Sula in a good way, and Toni Morrison's mastery of like using elements of horror and suspense, but also like this like rip roaring critique of like I don't know, systemic racism and
Right.
everyday life for people. And I don't know, you would love it.
Okay.
And the fiction that I'm going to revisit that I started reading a couple years ago that I was kind of surprised because I don't really read this era, but like Howard's End by Ian Forster
Oh,
is when I started rereading. I kind of don't really read a lot of that era of fiction because I don't know why, I just don't. But
sure.
I did decide to read it, and it blew my mind because I loved the movie, but the book is a different ball game.
Huh.
It's like third person omniscient narrator. It's There's a whole
Oh,
explanation of class issues and differences in this story around an umbrella accidentally being taken from one character to another. It's a
what?
story about three different families of different classes in England
Okay,
over a
I'm gonna
period of
stop.
years.
Like Ian Forster, like he shows up on the secondhand book market, and I'm just like, oh, I'll get to him. I'll get to him.
I read all of his books after I read this. It's so
Really,
good.
really, I
Yeah,
know
it's like
there's
juicy.
like, well, now I want to read it.
You
There's
need
like
to.
there's a couple of channels that are doing an Ian Forster read along for the whole
Oh,
year.
really?
Yeah, Jen the librarian is, and she's like, they have one a month, and I'm like, I
Oof.
saw it and I was like, oh yeah, I'll get to it. I'll get to,
Oh,
Ian Forster eventually. Like that's kind of my attitude. But now I'm
that
like,
was my attitude.
ding, like,
Because especially because he's like a gay writer that like,
yeah,
is important. And I've seen like all the movie adaptations of his books and I love them. So
okay,
I was like, okay, I need to read it. So I started with Howard's End because I bought this Barnes and Noble version a million years ago.
right.
And
It's like the classic that
I,
sits on your shelf,
yeah,
that just sits there and like collects
it
dust.
I ate it up. I just
Huh,
like consumed it. I
huh.
inhaled it. It was so funny. It
Yeah.
was so biting and evocative and lush. It was just so many different things I didn't know that he could do. And
Okay.
so yeah, and so after that I read all of his other books, which I also for the most part really like. There was a few that were my favorite, but like Morris, the one that was published after he died, which is like a gay love story, is like phenomenal. Room with a View is amazingly structured. I love A Room with a View.
Huh.
But Howard's Ends is like, there's a reason why it's his most like I can't get enough. I mean, I loved the movie growing up, but once I read the book, I was like, the book is just so next level, how it's structured. And
Interesting.
yeah, and the characters are just they just stay with you. It's so interesting how he wrote it. And it's
Yeah.
just like, so there's a lot of symbolism in it, right? But it's not so over the top. It just like
Slapping you in the face or whatever. Yeah.
Yes, it's like perfectly. So that's a new favorite that I've been revisiting once a year since maybe a couple years ago.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I know. I recently read Middlemarch by George Eliot. I don't know if you've read that.
No, I'm actually thinking of picking it up because you read it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, there's one of the themes in the book, without spoiling it, is sort of believing your life, like so strongly believing your life is supposed to go one way, and then grappling with the reality that it didn't go the way that you thought.
Oh,
and
so good.
I know, right? So here
good.
I am. I was like talking to Ted, my husband, about it, and I was like sobbing, and I was just like, but then I was like, I can't. For years, I thought Middlemarch would just be like over my head. Like I thought I wouldn't get it, and I thought it wouldn't have like any resonant themes. And here I am, just a mere few months ago, like crying because I could like so fiercely identify with like the way that she was saying it, and like the sort of the naivety of your youth when you just so believe that like, you know, this like, you know, this person is going to be this thing for you forever, or, you know, or that you're going to live in this space and this is who you're going to be. And then like realizing that your life didn't turn out the way that you thought, even if it is differently beautiful. But so I was listening to you speak about Howard's End, and I was just like kind of brought back to that moment where I was like, I think for so long you think you have this idea of how something is going to be, and then you actually get into it and you're like, wow.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, that I remember you saying that in your like initial review, and I was like, oh, I definitely need, like, that's definitely in the place. I mean, because we're like both in our 30s. Like, I feel like there's a certain point when you're like 35, 36, or however, you just are like, oh, these choices mean something. Like, it's very it's really prescient. Yeah.
All right, well, our time is going to run out, so I don't want it to just like cut us off. Thank you for being on my channel and sharing.
A pleasure. Loved it.
Thank you. I love this. This is great. Yeah, seriously.
Bye, Shelly.
Bye.